Thank you, colleagues. Today I rise before this great august body to address the unintended consequences that I find in this bill. One was in line 83, where when we talk about it, starting at line 75, it says, in the court's discretion, a judge may depart from the mandatory minimum sentence specified for a person who is convicted of a violation of this code section as set forth in paragraph 2 of this subsection if the judge concludes that 78, the defendant was not the leader of a criminal conduct. 79, the defendant did not possess or use a firearm, dangerous weapon, or hazardous object during the crime. The criminal conduct did not result in the death or serious bodily injury to a person other than to a person who was a party to the crime. The defendant has no prior felony conviction, and the interest of justice will not be served by the imposition of the prescribed mandatory minimum sentence. And B, if a judge departs from the mandatory minimum sentence pursuant to this paragraph, the judge shall specify on the record the circumstances for the reduction and the interest served by such departure, and such order shall be appealable by the state of Georgia pursuant to Code 5-7-1. And the reason this is important to me is because when you talk about the and or the or, you can get a felony for just about everything in the state of Georgia. And I want to talk about what it's like to grow up in a poor and impoverished community, because you can buy something off the street and you can be charged with felony theft by receiving stolen property, right? You can be charged with that. You should have known that it didn't come from a store. Well, how did I know? How did they acquire it? You should have known, because ignorance of the law is no excuse. I've heard many judges say that. And so there are unintended consequences that I could have a prior felony. What if I am a worker or an employee and I bounce a check on my personal check account? You can be charged with a felony in the state of Georgia. My check didn't hit because the company was late. The rental company doesn't care about that. They proceed through the legal process to take it to the sheriff's office, and I'm sure the gentleman could attest in this chamber that the sheriff will follow up and they will prosecute that case. You can be charged with a felony. You can plead First Offenders Act. Guess what? By this code section, if I'm guilty by association, I'm not eligible to receive any of the benefits in this code section. And so when I look at this bill, I want to talk about what are we trying to address? Is it the leniency in sentencing? But I don't think that's a major problem here in Georgia. And increasing penalties, if that was the absolute to deterring crime, we shouldn't have any crime. But the issue, colleagues, is not about increasing the penalty. The issue is about more law enforcement officers in communities, more social services, more wraparound services, because the presence of a police officer may help to stop someone from committing a crime, but it may also help someone get help. Judges have not been on the loose in sentencing and just letting everybody go, because in my county, in the Eastern Judicial Circuit, they will sentence an individual based on the crime. And I assure you that the most violent and serious offenders in Chatham County are sentenced by the rule of law, to the letter of law, and to the fact of law, as a judge has the opportunity to sentence them. We do not let people who are violent offenders go in Chatham County. They will serve their time. But there's also the unintended people that this legislation would wrap around and bring into the Georgia Department of Corrections, because it brings into the association of what is a gang. Why would you even be a part of a gang? Well, let's talk about it. I don't know if you've ever been in poverty, impoverished, or you've had the opportunity to live in the neighborhood that I grew up in, but there's an opportunity in a gang, and that's protection. Because if there's a neighboring gang across the street, you better pick a side to be on, because depending on what side you may be on, may determine life or death for you that day. Maybe it's economics, maybe it's some cultural things, but my question is, I haven't seen the legislation for prevention. A wise man once said, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. When I heard in the Children and Families Committee how overloaded DFACS caseworkers were, and you tell me that crime is on the rise and gangs are at a rise, I would also maybe dare to attribute it to the balance and caseload of caseworkers. That maybe if they had a smaller caseload, they could give more direct attentive attention to the children in their custody and care, because they didn't have so many children to care for. Maybe if you said that gangs were on the rise, I would also wonder about the treatment of children who would get mental health services and need additional services for mental health clinicians. But I would tell you that those who are on Medicaid in the state of Georgia, because the reimbursement rate is so low, they can't find a private provider to treat them for their mental health problems. But some things can be self-medicated. They can be self-medicated through drugs, and they can be self-medicated from the sense of wanting to belong to something, to feel important. We all are part of a group of the Georgia Senate. We all wear a nice lapel pin. We're a part of a group. We sought to come to this body. Let's be careful of how we criminalize those who seek to belong to another body because they have other cultural implications. They don't have the ability to change their neighborhood. They can't take all of the people out of their neighborhood. If they could, we'd pack them up and we'd move them. And so, as I get to the end of what I wanted to talk about in this legislation, when we talk about what you have to offer to get the reduction in the sentence, where I'm from, that's called snitching. And if you decide to tell, I want you to know that you leave family members behind. The state doesn't relocate your mother and father, your children, those you leave behind, so they become the victims of retaliatory behavior. This doesn't address what happens to those who are victims of retaliatory behavior. So if I love my loved ones and I love my family, it's best that I keep my mouth quiet and take the sentence. Because if I do that, I might keep them alive. Because if the state truly wanted to see a reduction in gang violence and gang crimes in this state, we would offer more services and victim and witness protection so that those who choose to testify to get the most dangerous people off our streets would have protection. But they don't have protection. So why should I cooperate when the lives of my loved ones will be on the line? So here I close, colleagues, just to share with you this. I didn't get to choose my neighborhood. I didn't get to choose the people in my neighborhood. I didn't sometimes get to choose the friends that I had. My grandmother wanted me to do many great things, but sometimes I was guilty by association. You know why? Because when I was a part of the group, if I was the one that didn't participate or go wherever they went, I was lame, you scary, you got to go in the house, they make fun of you, ridicule you, and the next day I might get jumped at the bus stop. That's the reality. But I always tell people the greatest intervention was social programs like the Boy Scouts, where those leaders invested in me, gave me opportunities, saw something better in myself. Where's the legislation and the funding to help, get kids services, not send them to prison? Because if you send them to prison, you further perpetuate the need that they will have to belong to a gang. Because in order to survive in prison, you got to be a part of some group. Because if you don't, those folks don't make it. And if you don't believe me, you can find all of the stories and all of the biopics of people who survive in prison, because there's a mentality in prison and a subculture in prison that if you send someone there because of their involvement in a gang, whether they were the ringleader or the lowest man on the totem pole, this legislation would make them equal. But the person at the top, as the gentleman said earlier, would get an opportunity to get off, but the gentleman at the very lowest common denominator that may just be guilty by association has no opportunity to find any reduction in sentence and will go to prison. And so I'd hate to find an opportunity where a kid like myself, who just happened to be there, not knowing what was happening, had not been a part of any criminal enterprise or a part of any crime, but by the virtue of the statute in the state of Georgia where two people are gathered, you can be a part of a gang. And if I had no prior knowledge, what good is it to prove it in court if the other two could testify to get their time cut to say that I was the ringleader, that I did it? Because by virtue of this legislation, that's, my friends, what we're enabling to happen. Those who are at the top of the pyramid can get their time cut by telling on someone at the bottom of the pyramid that may not have anything to do with it. And so those who deserve a second chance or another opportunity won't get it, and the people who are actually the violent, most criminal offenders with the most information to share will receive a reduction in their sentence because it's prudent for justice. So, colleagues, I ask that you consider all of the amendments that are before you today, and I ask that we look at how we really make a change in gangs in the state of Georgia, and how we look at gangs, and how we look at the issues that are perplexing us, because you cannot arrest your way out of this. We didn't get here by arresting our way out of it, and some would argue that we did, but I encourage you that this will come from the investment in communities, reducing the caseloads of social workers, getting kids their medication and getting them treatment so that they can receive all of the luxuries. Because guess what? If you're in poverty, if you're in the hood, no matter where you are, you probably can't change your circumstance. You can't just pack up and move. Like some folks, if they don't like the schools, you can pack up and move. But some people are a product of their condition, and if we want to change the products, then we have to change their conditions. And changing their conditions does not send them to prison. It provides them with social workers, clinicians, more police officers, because if you wanted to tell something and you wanted to report something in your community, who would you call? As a parent, how would you find help? Who would you call to say that your child was engaging in this type of behavior? Who would you get to help you work with a troubled child, because as we've heard in our Committee on Children and Families, nobody likes to work with troubled children. And so, colleagues, the children that will be affected by this legislation are those troubled children who don't have anybody else to speak for them. And with that, Mr. President, I hope that I've spoken for those children today. And with that, I will yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. You have no